There were so many. I love the Beach Boys, but
The
they
Beach
weren't really a
Boys.
band. They were just boys.
Yes.
And then they became beach men.
Imagine sitting in a quiet Sussex drawing room, the afternoon light softening the dust motes, motoring in an old leather armchair. At 80 years old, Pattie Boyd has lived a life that reads like a fever dream of fashion shoots, rock and roll excess, and whispered betrayals behind closed doors. Now, after decades of holding her secrets close, she has finally agreed to break her silence. The story she tells is not the glossy rock icon narrative the world expects. It is the story of a young woman who chased beauty and love and found herself trapped between two of the greatest guitarists of all time. At 80, she admits the polished snapshots hide sharp edges, and every halo casts a shadow. She sits forward, eyes bright with conviction, and dares the world to reckon with her truth. Born in March 1944 on a damp Somerset morning, young Pattie was a child of moving targets. Between RAF postings and silent fractures at home, she learned early that love could fall apart without warning. Sent off to boarding school amid the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, she experienced fear as a constant companion, whether it came from the political violence around her or the sudden wordless divorce of her parents. At 8, she discovered betrayal not from strangers, but from the adults sworn to protect her. Her mother had remarried a stranger in an instant, and her father's absence stretched into a hollow ache. These early cracks would later echo in the shadows of her marriages. Back in London at 17, Pattie's life pivoted from convent greys to camera flashes. Shampooing at an exclusive Bond Street salon, she washed the hair of women built on empires and old money. When a mysterious editor suggested she try modeling, Pattie stepped in front of the lens and never looked back. Within a year, her face graced Vogue covers, her style set the tone of an era, and designers whispered her name. Yet behind the backstage glamour, she clung to a secret. Beauty, like youth, faded, and every moment in limelight passed while she wondered if she would ever find something deeper than the next photo shoot. In 1964, her world collided with the Beatles. George Harrison was polite, introspective, and entirely drawn to Pattie's quiet confidence. Their marriage crowned her as rock royalty overnight, offering worlds of privilege but little privacy. While the public saw sunlit trips to India and whispered chants with the Maharishi, Pattie navigated a hidden tempest, a husband drawn to new forms of devotion, sometimes at her expense. She watched George slip into spiritual ecstasy just as he drifted from their vows. The love song written for her became a haunting echo of promises unkept. In whispers, she kept her doubts from the tabloids, even as the foundation beneath her began to tremble. When Eric Clapton entered her life, it felt like fate's cruel joke. The friend who once played George's guitar found his desires ignited by Pattie's grace. Their affair blossomed in secret, a heady rush of passion and guilt. She believed she was claiming her freedom, but soon found herself entangled in a marriage scarred by violence, addiction, and crushing betrayal. While she invested in IVF treatments and hope for children, Eric fathered babies in the dark and left Pattie in agonizing uncertainty. She endured bruises and broken promises, learning that power in a relationship could be wielded like a weapon. Now, 16 years after her final walk down the aisle, Pattie Boyd looks back with an unflinching eye. She speaks not as a victim, but as a survivor who reclaimed her narrative. The woman who once endured years of hidden heartache now stands liberated by honesty. At 80, she chooses words over silence, reframing her legacy from muse to author of her own story. Her revelations aren't buried in dusty memoirs, they're spoken here, raw and unvarnished. And as she leans in to share her final lesson, you realize this conversation is not just about celebrity scandal. It's a call to anyone who has ever wondered if silence is worth the price of protecting someone else's image. And later, she will unpack the untold moments. The night she realized devotion can become abandonment, the moment a guitar solo cut deeper than any blade, and the secret journal entry she burned to hide a truth she feared no one could bear. You'll hear her own words, unfiltered and unforgettable, as she dares you to challenge everything you thought you knew about love, music, and the price of fame. This is not just Pattie Boyd's story. It's a mirror for anyone who has ever dared to love too fiercely. Stay with us. Brace truth. The air in the Harrison household was always punctuated by guitar riffs and chanting mantras, as if sound itself could stitch together the cracks that grew between Pattie and her husband. In those early years, the mansion in Henley-on-Thames felt like a refuge from paparazzi helicopters. But it also became a gilded cage. Mornings began with George strumming sitar patterns in candlelight, his full devotion cast toward some unseen realm, while Pattie, dressed in the kaleidoscope of Mary Quant fashions, moved silently alongside him, her own voice fading under the weight of his spiritual hunger. The contrast was stark. To the world, they were the ideal Beatle bride and rock god, But behind closed doors she wrestled with a growing sense of abandonment. Their wedding had been a fairy tale. Pattie in ivory satin, her wide eyes shining as she took George's hand beneath an altar of white roses. The photographers captured every delicate fold of her gown, every relieved smile as her father gave her away. Friends called it the most romantic moment in rock history, and for a time she believed it. But romance can wither if one partner looks inward for divine truth and the other searches for earthly connection. Pattie learned that devotion can fracture when devotion is given unevenly. She watched George drift from breakfast to meditation circles with the Maharishi, his laughless gaze fixed on horizons she could not reach. Each photo shoot she did for Vogue or Vanity Fair broadened her fame, but it also sharpened her isolation. Glimmering lights and rolling cameras turned her into an icon while her own identity blurred behind halos of public adoration. Night after night she heard cheers, yet in her bedchamber she felt the hush of loneliness. He asked her to stop modeling. He believed the lens stole her soul. She stopped, but in the silence she found no solace. Removing her own agency handed him more control, but it did nothing to fill the empty space in his arms. The love song he'd written for her echoed through their halls, a reminder of a passion now distant. Then Eric arrived with a different soundtrack. His guitar licks were less celestial prayer and more raw human ache. A friend first, he visited often, laughing comfortably at dinner parties, bantering with George about new chords and upcoming gigs. When he first looked at Pattie, his admiration felt warm, genuine, as if he were seeing her, not an avatar in Beatles lore. She found in him eager eyes, hungry for a connection she'd craved for years. Their friendship bloomed against the backdrop of London's swinging 60s, but their alliance carried the weight of unspoken longing. Underneath the laughter she began to suspect something more, an electric undercurrent neither time nor space could mute. Their affair unfolded in secret rooms and dimly lit corridors, the kind of clandestine love that crackles with guilt and thrill. One night, after a dinner party, Eric took her hand and guided her into a deserted studio, guitars leaning like silent witnesses. The air smelled of aged wood and spilled wine. He asked her to play along, to indulge a fantasy more intoxicating than any drug she'd ever tried. When she agreed, the applause they imagined belonged only to them. In that moment, Pattie believed she had found freedom, a chance to reclaim her voice and her body, both of which felt tethered to George's spiritual quests. Yet freedom came with its own chains. Eric's passion emerged alongside darker compulsions, mood swings, jealousy so violent it bruised more than her heart. He alternated between worshipping her beauty and punishing her for her loyalty to George. On nights when he spun into drunken rage, Pattie counted the cracks in the ceiling, praying he'd sleep before the violence began. She wore long sleeves to hide bruises, applied makeup to mask tears, and whispered sacred mantras to herself so she wouldn't scream. The public never saw this. They saw a couple of rock icons entwined in perfect harmony. But those images lay over a tapestry of betrayal and pain, invisible to every fan with their eyes glued to stage lights. While she endured the cycle of hope and despair, she sought a child, imagining motherhood as the ultimate balm for her wounded heart. She underwent one IVF round after another, each injection of hormones a gamble, each failure another lesson in despair. Behind the scenes, Eric was already fathering children with other women. He sired a daughter named Ruth, with a studio manager, and later a son named Connor, with a model halfway across the world. She learned of these secret births not through his confession, but through tabloid whispers and fleeting admissions. Each revelation struck her like a physical blow, a betrayal too raw for words. The contrast between her dreams of unity and the stark reality of Eric's duplicity sharpened every wound. One night, during a dinner in Los Angeles, he spilled the truth in a drunken confession. "Of course I'm having children. What right do I have to your body if I am free to enjoy another?" She left the table stunned, walking the silent corridors of a rented mansion, wondering how love could turn so venomous. Eric's own remorse was as fleeting as his guilt. He apologized, then laughed, weaving lies so smoothly she almost believed them. By 1977, the marriage unraveled completely. Divorce papers landed on her doorstep like grenades, claiming adultery and unreasonable behavior. In truth, it was about physical abuse, emotional terror, rape, a catalog of violations she had buried deep to survive. When she filed, the world shifted. Headlines screamed the end of a rock and roll union, but omitted the darkness within. Pattie vowed that their story would not be hers alone to bear. She would speak, she would name names, and she would reclaim the power he'd stolen. Now, as she sits in that Sussex armchair, her spine straight, her voice unwavering, Pattie Boyd breaks her silence for the final time. She looks directly into the lens, not as a muse but as a woman who has weathered storms and emerged victorious. And she warns us all, fidelity is more than promises. It is respect. Love is not ownership. and a silence protected at the expense of one's truth becomes the loudest scream of regret. In the quiet aftermath of her divorce, Pattie Boyd felt as though she had lost two versions of herself: the starry-eyed bride who believed in fairy tale promises, and the high-fashion muse whose identity had been woven into magazine spreads. Yet in that emptiness lay fertile ground for reinvention. She gathered the fragments of her life, photographs she'd snapped in India, backstage shots of rock legends, personal journal entries, and transformed them into an art form that belonged wholly to her. Armed with a second-hand camera, she began to frame truth instead of glamour, capturing raw moments. George Harrison deep in silent meditation, an exhausted John Lennon cradling a newborn Sean, Eric Clapton's haunted gaze backstage after a concert. Each image was a reclamation of agency, a refusal to let her narrative be bound by others' cords. Her first private exhibition, held in 1971, was an intimate affair. Patrons squeezed into a converted Chelsea townhouse, sipping sherry as they examined grainy Polaroids of farewell embraces and candid backstage confessions. The show, titled Through the Eye of a Muse, sold out within days. Critics praised her uncanny ability to capture the vulnerability beneath the veneer of fame, noting how her photographs seemed to hum with unspoken electric tension. For Pattie, it was more than validation. It was proof that her voice, at long last, could speak volumes without saying a word. As she built her photography career through the 1980s, she also founded Jennifer Juniper, the boutique in Chelsea she'd dreamed of since the days of swinging London. Co-founded with her sister, the store sold vintage couture alongside handcrafted jewelry, each piece selected to honor the same spirit of rebellion that had defined her modeling days. Customers included rock promoters and art collectors alike, drawn by the store's understated elegance and Pattie's warm, personal touch. In those years, she also penned the column Pattie's Letter from London for 16 magazine, writing candid advice on fashion and self-worth to teenage readers on the other side of the Atlantic. She urged them to find strength in style, but never to allow anyone else to define their beauty. In the quiet aftermath of her divorce, Pattie Boyd felt as though she had lost two versions of herself: the starry-eyed bride who believed in fairy tale promises, and the high-fashion muse whose identity had been woven into magazine spreads. Yet in that emptiness lay fertile ground for reinvention. She gathered the fragments of her life, photographs she'd snapped in India, backstage shots of rock legends, personal journal entries, and transformed them into an art form that belonged wholly to her. Armed with a second-hand camera, she began to frame truth instead of glamour, capturing raw moments. George Harrison deep in silent meditation, an exhausted John Lennon cradling a newborn Sean, Eric Clapton's haunted gaze backstage after a concert. Each image was a reclamation of agency, a refusal to let her narrative be bound by others' cords. Her first private exhibition, held in 19, was an intimate affair. Patrons squeezed into a converted Chelsea townhouse, sipping sherry as they examined grainy Polaroids of farewell embraces and candid backstage confessions. The show, titled Through the Eye of a Muse, sold out within days. Critics praised her uncanny ability to capture the vulnerability beneath the veneer of fame, noting how her photographs seemed to hum with unspoken electric tension. For Pattie, it was more than validation. It was proof that her voice, at long last, could speak volumes without saying a word. As she built her photography career through the 1980s, she also founded Jennifer Juniper, the boutique in Chelsea she dreamed of since the days of swinging London. Co-founded with her sister, the store sold vintage couture alongside handcrafted jewelry, each piece selected to honor the same spirit of rebellion that had defined her modeling days. Customers included rock promoters and art collectors alike, drawn by the store's understated elegance and Pattie's warm, personal touch. In those years, she also penned the column Pattie's Letter from London for 16 magazine, writing candid advice on fashion and self-worth to teenage readers on the other side of the Atlantic. She urged them to find strength in style but never to allow anyone else to define their beauty. In 2007, 2 decades after her final split from Eric Clapton, she published her memoir, Wonderful Tonight. It was a raw, unvarnished chronicle of love's promises and betrayals, a confession of bruises both visible and hidden. Readers were stunned by her admission of sexual coercion. Eric's words, recorded on camera, admitting that in their marriage, he had treated her body as an entitlement. When she wrote, "I felt erased, like a shadow living in someone else's life," her words kindled a fire in readers who had suffered similarly but remained silent. The book topped bestseller lists, not because it was celebrity gossip, but because it was a blueprint for reclaiming one's story amid devastating betrayals. Her memoir tour took her across the US and Europe, where she stood before sold-out auditoriums and recounted her journey in her own voice. She spoke of the terror she felt as a child in Kenya under curfew, the confusion of wearing a wedding dress in front of flashing cameras, the suffocating nights spent hoping a spouse's rage would subside. Yet she also celebrated the small triumphs, mastering the darkroom, finding an overdue sense of purpose, falling in love again. Her final tour stop in Seattle drew a standing ovation when she revealed that she had found peace, not through fame or fortune, but through forgiveness, first of herself, then of the men who had wounded her. In 2015, at age 71, Pattie married Rod Weston, a property developer she had known since the early 90s. The ceremony at Chelsea Old Town Hall was intimate and unpretentious, attended by lifelong friends and a handful of family. She wore a silver brocade dress and a hat so large it felt like a gentle halo. When Rod took her hand, she saw in his eyes a devotion untainted by obsession, a respect that neither demanded nor diminished her. That day she whispered to a friend, "This time I'm marrying freedom." The guests laughed, understanding that for Pattie Boyd, freedom had always been both an aspiration and a refuge. As she approached 80, she began preparing for one final chapter, the auction of her personal collection at Christie's. Handwritten Beatles love letters, unseen photos of the Maharishi's private refuge, Eric Clapton's childhood guitar, over 100 items that held the paradox of her life's loves and losses. When the hammer fell and her collection fetched £2.82 million, she pledged the proceeds to charities supporting victims of domestic abuse and children undergoing long-term medical treatments. "These objects belong to a past that both elevated and imprisoned me," she wrote in the auction catalog. "Now they can bring healing to others." And in March 2024, just days after her 80th birthday, she granted the interview that would break her final silence. She sat before a single camera, no entourage or stylized lighting, just Pattie and her truths. With calm clarity, she recounted the night George Harrison proposed over a train window, the moment Eric's letter revealed his duplicity, the minutes she spent holding journals and fearing their words might vanish into history's fog. She spoke not to scandalize, but to illuminate. If someone you love carries secrets that erode your soul, you owe it to yourself to speak. Silence may protect their image, but it destroys your spirit. Then, in a twist that left viewers breathless, she admitted that despite every bruise, every heartbreak, her heart's truest resonance belonged to the man who had first loved her with quiet devotion. "George was my true love," she said, her voice steady. "Even when I hated what he became, I could always find his kindness at the bottom of my memories. He showed me that love can be gentle, if you have the grace to receive it." As the camera lingered on her serene expression, the world realized that the most powerful revelations are not those that scandalize, but those that forgive. She leaned back, clasping her hands in her lap, and offered one last thought. "Your story is yours alone. No fame, no fortune, no promise of eternity can justify the price of your truth." Then she smiled, the years of turmoil lifting from her shoulders like a sunset's final glow. And as the screen faded to black, her words echoed, "Speak, reclaim, live." Even as the final credits rolled on that intimate interview, the reverberations of Pattie Boyd's words continued to pulse through living rooms and lecture halls alike. Critics called it brutal honesty, fans hailed it as a triumph of self-determination, but beyond the headlines, something deeper was unfolding, a quiet revolution in how we understand love, loyalty, and the art of saying enough. For a generation raised on idealized romance and glossy fairy tales, her confession felt like a wake-up call, the recognition that even the most storied relationships can conceal fractures so deep they threaten to splinter the soul. In the weeks that followed, social media became the stage for new conversations. Hashtags like Speak Your Truth and Muses No More trended as followers shared their own stories of silence and survival. Young women in Tokyo and Sao Paulo posted selfies holding copies of Wonderful Tonight, captions reading, "No more hiding bruises in sleeveless tops," or "Learning that my body belongs to me." Workshops on emotional boundary setting sprang up from London to Los Angeles, anchored by quotes from Pattie's speech, "Silence may protect their image, but it destroys your spirit." Suddenly, her personal reckoning had ignited a global dialogue on consent, control, and the courage to reclaim one's narrative. The contrast between Pattie's early conformity and her late-life rebellion could not be sharper. Once the dutiful RAF daughter who obeyed convent rules, and then the obedient model who deferred to George's wishes, she now stood as an icon of autonomy. Observers noted that her final chapter unfolded not on opulent red carpets, but in modest galleries and sober TV studios, spaces where the gravity of her message could land unencumbered by glitz. She traded yachts for art fairs, paparazzi for panel discussions, transforming her legacy from passive muse to active mentor. Academics began dissecting her journey as a case study in gender politics. Psychology forums broke down the stages of her awakening, the initial shock of parental abandonment, the disillusionment of being owned rather than adored, the guilt that accompanied breaking vows long idealized by pop culture. Feminist scholars pointed to her refusal to stay silent about marital rape as a watershed moment, one that reframed historic legal definitions. Meanwhile, music historians revisited Harrison and Clapton's lyrics under a new light, parsing metaphors of captivity in songs once celebrated as love anthems. But Pattie's story was never solely about scandal or activism. It was at its core a testament to resilience. After the auction of her personal artifacts, she surprised many by spending months traveling to small coastal towns and inner-city community centers, hosting free photography workshops for survivors of domestic abuse. She taught them to turn their cameras inward, to frame not only external subjects but the scars and triumphs etched on their own hearts. The best portraits, she often said, capture moments you thought you'd forgotten. In these gatherings she spoke candidly of the nights she believed she might not survive, of the cocktails of pills she took to silence the pain, and of the lifelines thrown by therapists who refused to let her drift into invisibility. Her pupils listened as she demonstrated how to develop film in dim, steamy darkrooms, explaining that patience and careful exposure mirrored the slow work of healing. By the time the prints emerged, each shadow and highlight had taken on profound symbolism: the darkness of abuse, the light of reclamation. Journalists followed her at first, expecting scandalous sound bites. Instead, they found the same calm determination that had marked her final interview. She declined sensational headlines, insisting stories focus on survivors, not perpetrators. When asked whether she regretted airing her private life, she replied, "Regret is for people who stay silent." Her posture, measured words, and steady gaze conveyed a conviction that words could build as effectively as walls. Parallel to her outreach, Pattie embarked on a collaborative series of podcasts called Echoes of Freedom, co-hosted with survivors, psychologists, and musicians. Each episode began with a raw guitar riff, a subtle nod to her two most famous exes, before morphing into intimate dialogues about reclaiming joy, forging new identities, and the role of art in recovery. The podcast soared in popularity, ranking in the top 10 globally for weeks. But beyond the metrics, the real metric lay in the emails she received, from a teenage girl in New Delhi who found her voice after years of silencing herself, from a retired factory worker in Pittsburgh who finally left an abusive marriage at 69 because she realized it's never too late. These ripples extended into film and literature. Screenwriters optioned her memoir, adapting it into a limited series that cast her as both protagonist and narrator. In interviews, lead actresses marveled at Pattie's refusal to glamorize suffering. She demanded authenticity, even if it meant casting actors with visible scars or using real archival footage that shook audience expectations. Critics praised the series for its unflinching portrayal of marital violence and the painstaking process of healing, proof that her life's final act was as groundbreaking as her stint on Vogue covers had once been. As the years passed, Pattie Boyd settled into a rhythm that balanced public advocacy with private tranquility. She and Rod Weston renovated a small farmhouse near Chichester, planting a garden of native wildflowers she described as a living tapestry of second chances. On weekday mornings, she could be found in the greenhouse, camera slung over her shoulder, photographing dew-laden petals. Those images, later exhibited alongside her early celebrity portraits, formed a visual narrative of transformation, from glossy youth to wounded bride to wise survivor. And so, the story that began with a broken-hearted child in Kenya and meandered through the glitz of the night, only to unravel in baton-wielding domestic disturbances, culminated in a woman who had embraced every chapter, shameful, joyful, and redemptive. At 80, Pattie Boyd had distilled decades of public fascination and private torment into a single clear directive: speak, reclaim, live. 3 words that might sound deceptively simple, yet resonate with the weight of all she endured. This final section of her script closes not with a scandalous revelation or a romantic twist, but with an invitation. An invitation to anyone who has ever held their tongue for fear of rocking the boat. Anyone who has traded their truth for someone else's comfort. As the scene fades, viewers are left with the gentle image of Pattie's camera moving from one blossoming flower to the next, each frame a testament to renewal. And in that soft focus, they hear her voice, calm but unyielding: "Your story matters. Don't let anyone else write it for you." In the quiet conclusion of her televised revelation, we see Pattie rising from her armchair, the camera lingering on lines etched by both laughter and tears. Those creases are not flaws. They are the chapters of a life lived unflinchingly. She steps outside onto the dew-soaked grass, each footfall deliberate, as though she is retracing every step from childhood boarding schools to the thresholds of private chateaus where her fate was decided. The morning fog curls around her like a gentle reminder. Even in obscured light, truth finds a way to shine. This final act is not simply the story of a muse who became the message. It is a blueprint for anyone who has ever wondered if they have the right to claim their own narrative. Pattie's journey teaches us that identity cannot be borrowed or bestowed. It must be seized. She once allowed her beauty to serve others' ambitions, first as a model molded by powerful men, then as a partner defined by two iconic guitarists. Now she demonstrates how to release that borrowed power and transform it into a force wholly your own. So what can we as viewers and listeners take from her 80-year odyssey? First, that courage does not always roar. At times it is a quiet voice at dawn declaring, "I will not be silent." Whether that whisper happens in sumptuous ballrooms or in a cramped studio, it marks the moment you refuse to let fear dictate your fate. Pattie's first whisper came when she hid Vogue under her bed, allowing herself to fantasize about a life beyond convent rules. Her final roar came when she aired her darkest abuses, not to vilify, but to illuminate. Second, healing is neither linear nor solitary. Pattie's path wound through dark rooms and bright galleries, from the hush of therapy sessions to the applause of sold-out exhibitions. Each step required both solitude and solidarity. Solitude to confront her inner wounds, and solidarity to remind her that she was never alone. In her workshops, she showed hundreds how to photograph bruises and blossoms alike, forging a community bound by honesty. It is that combination, personal reckoning paired with communal support, that turns survival into transformation. Third, legacy is not a museum of trophies, it is an active conversation. Pattie could have retired into anonymity after her book release or her gallery tour, but she chose instead to speak into the winds of change. By gifting proceeds to charities and by mentoring survivors through the lens of her camera, she ensured that her story would ripple outward, touching lives she would never meet. Legacy, she reminds us, is not what you accumulate but what you release into the world. As the film of her life rolls toward intermission, you are left with an invitation and a challenge. An invitation to examine the hidden cracks in the relationships you trust and the power dynamics you accept without question. A challenge to reclaim the chapters of your story that were written by others and to draft new verses in your own hand. Pattie's final lesson is simple. The cost of silence is a debt paid in regret, but the currency of truth is invaluable.